The 2020 New Zealand election is taking place at a pivotal moment in world history. The COVID-19 pandemic has illustrated to masses of people that capitalism cannot provide for and protect the vast majority of the world's population. Under capitalism, the people of the world cannot do something as simple and vital as produce personal protective equipment and provide adequate amounts of that produce to nurses, doctors, and other frontline workers. Around the world, including in New Zealand, hospitals are understaffed and under-resourced despite decades of warnings from health experts about the risk of a pandemic and the need for better, more accessible healthcare. As the infection rate from COVID-19 has climbed globally, the international ruling class has prioritized private profiteering over public health. International leaders like Donald Trump have continued to cultivate anti-scientific and fascistic tendencies designed to obscure truth and crush opposition. On our movement's website, the World Socialist website, we have termed this pandemic a trigger event. Similar to the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, which provided the impetus for World War I, the pandemic has not changed economic relations between classes or caused new antagonisms between national rulers. It has only exacerbated and heightened existing tensions. Workers must recognize that this election is not an opportunity to vote for the so-called lesser evil. It is a contest between two factions of a ruling class that is inalienably hostile to the social rights and needs of the working class. This election, workers must recognize the urgent need to make an uncompromising break from the parties of capitalism and to join the fight to build a section of the International Socialist Equality Party in New Zealand. So our first speaker, John Braddock, will explain further dangers posed by this trigger event. He will also discuss the international drive towards war as the United States fights to develop economic and military competitors. He will also discuss the growing risk of fascism cultivated by Trump and similar political leaders. John is a member of the Socialist Equality Party group in New Zealand, and he is a regular contributor to the World Socialist website on New Zealand and Pacific issues. Our second speaker, Caroline Kennett, will talk about how the international working class has responded to the pandemic to date. Workers around the world have mounted resistance to workplace and school openings amidst the spreading of infection. Caroline Kennett is a member of the Socialist Equality Party in Australia, and she is also a member of the Committee for Public Education, which was set up to defend educators from edubusiness and capitalism. Finally, our third speaker, Tom Peters, will talk about the right-wing record of the Ardern government. The Labour Party government, contrary to its posturing as kind, has implemented policies that favour the wealthy in New Zealand, and they're set to continue the history of Labour governing over worsening paying conditions for workers. So with that, I'll hand over to John to begin his report.
Good afternoon and welcome to those of you who are joining this meeting from wherever you are in New Zealand or internationally. As many of you know from the events of recent weeks, the New Zealand election on October the 17th is taking place in the context of an unprecedented global crisis. It is impossible to understand what is happening in the New Zealand election outside the vast shifts in world politics that we have witnessed in the past week. In fact, these developments shatter the national mythology, which is running right through the election campaign of New Zealand exceptionalism. As the Trump-Biden debate exposed, the US, the so-called pillar of Western democracy, is in the grip of a profound process of rot and decay of enormous significance to every country. As the World Socialist website has declared, this debate signalled, quote, the United States moment of truth, the myth of an invulnerable and eternal American democracy has been shattered. Political reality has burst through and exposed the undeniable fact that the White House is the political nerve centre of a far advanced conspiracy to establish a presidential dictatorship and suppress constitutionally guaranteed democratic rights, unquote. Regarding the news over the past 24 hours of Trump's COVID-19 test, Whatever is the truth behind this, and that is yet to be revealed, and whatever the outcome, we are not simply dealing here with a single individual. Trump is the representative of a corrupt and degenerate ruling class and the putrid expression of a far deeper systemic disease. The chaotic situation now enveloping the White House could well prompt an even sharper turn to the right. When Trump's refusal to accept the results of an election provokes mass protests, which may well happen, he will call on the police and federal paramilitary forces backed by the US Army and Marines to restore order on the streets of America. Trump is not conducting a traditional election campaign. He's preparing a coup d'etat, inciting fascist violence with calls for right-wing vigilante organisations to monitor polling places and not accept the results. His appeal to the Proud Boys this week to, quote, stand back and stand by is a sign of this. His intention is to block the counting of mail-in ballots by appealing for federal court intervention in many states on bogus claims of vote fraud. He expects the Supreme Court, with a 6-3 right-wing majority, to provide a reliable guarantee of success on the model of the notorious stolen election of 2000 that installed George W. Bush with the collaboration of the Democrats and their candidate, Al Gore. On this authoritarian basis, Trump intends to consolidate a fascistic anti-working class regime committed to far-ranging attacks on democratic rights, social benefits, jobs and living standards. The Democratic Party offers no resistance to this. Fearful of the rising tide of popular opposition from below, the Democrats are appealing to the military to intervene to ensure a transition of power. However these developments ultimately play out, the crisis of democracy in Washington will transfer to the international stage. Whatever is happening in the US is the sharpest expression of what is happening everywhere, including in New Zealand. How has this come about? Most immediately, there is the role of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our movement has stressed that the pandemic is a trigger event that could have been foreseen and prevented. Like the outbreak of World War I, the coronavirus outbreak has both revealed and exacerbated the fundamental contradictions of the capitalist system around the world. This week, the number of COVID-19 cases reached over 34 million worldwide, with over 1 million deaths. A second deadly wave is unfolding across parts of Europe. It has exposed the criminal responsibility of capitalist governments everywhere, which have adopted policies of opening up the economy, that is, generating profits, at the expense of proper measures to protect public health. They are now preparing to impose mass unemployment and poverty on a scale not seen since the 1930s. These sharpening developments are in themselves not new. They follow the decay of American imperialism and global capitalism that included the financial crisis of 2008 and 25 years of uninterrupted imperialist wars in Afghanistan, the Middle East and elsewhere. At the centre of has been massive and ongoing pumping of funds into the financial markets. The unprecedented transfer of wealth to the upper classes in every country must now be paid for through an intensification of the assault on the working class. The shift towards fascistic rule arises directly from the enormous fear in ruling circles that they confront mass social anger that will take an explosive and revolutionary form. The turn to dictatorship arises from a situation in which the ruling class is no longer able to resolve its crisis through democratic means. Leon Trotsky, the founder of the Fourth International, warned that the Nazi regime of the 1930s was not a uniquely German phenomenon. He wrote, "In all countries, the same historic laws operate, the laws of capitalist decline. If the means of production remain in the hands of a small number of capitalists, there is no way out for society. It is condemned to go from crisis to crisis, from need to misery, from bad to worse. In the various countries, the decrepitude and disintegration of capitalism are expressed in diverse forms and at unequal rhythms, but the basic features of the process are the same everywhere. The bourgeoisie is leading its society to complete bankruptcy. It is capable of assuring people neither bread nor peace. This is precisely why it cannot any longer tolerate the democratic order. It is forced to smash the workers by the use of physical violence. The picture painted by the New Zealand ruling elite and world media that New Zealand is separate from this, that it has suppressed the pandemic and represents a haven of peace and tranquility at the bottom of the South Pacific is entirely false. In fact, New Zealand can no more isolate itself from the current maelstrom than it could from the imperialist carnage of the 20th century's two world wars. Jacinda Ardern's coalition government is itself a product of US intervention following the 2017 election. During coalition talks that followed the inconclusive election, US Ambassador Scott Brown, a Trump appointee, publicly criticised the incumbent National Party for failing to support Trump's threat to totally destroy North Korea. Brown gave 3 extraordinary media interviews to pressure any incoming government to more openly align and integrate with Washington. As a result, the far-right anti-immigrant New Zealand First Party formed a government with the Labour Party and the Greens, with whom its anti-immigrant and foreign policies were more closely aligned, instead of with National, which got more votes. Ardern gave New Zealand First Leader Winston Peters the key roles of Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, and the party's Deputy Leader Ron Mark, a former soldier, who was made the Defence Minister. This government is now fully aligned with Washington. Attempts by successive New Zealand governments to balance between the US, its traditional military ally, and China, its major trading partner, became increasingly untenable as President Obama, now followed by Trump, ramped up the military encirclement and economic pressure on Beijing. The dominant feature of the international situation is the drive by the imperialist powers led by Washington towards war. America's ruling oligarchy seeks to divert its intense and insoluble domestic tensions outwards. Military aggression is being ramped up as a means of offsetting the US decline of its global hegemony. Preparations for war against China are far advanced. Following escalating interventions in the South China Sea, Washington has recently been staging provocations over the island of Taiwan. The Ardern government has strengthened New Zealand's integration into US war preparations. A 2018 defence policy statement labelled China and Russia the main threats to the global order, echoing the Pentagon. It has also ramped up military spending and recruitment. This positioning has coincided with an intensifying anti-China campaign by sections of the New Zealand media, working with Australian politicians and US think tanks. A widely publicised report by the Christchurch academic Anne-Marie Brady, published days before the 2017 election, claimed that National was beholden to Chinese business interests and alleged without any evidence that 2 Chinese-born MPs were agents of the Chinese Communist Party. Brady, who was strongly supported by the trade union-funded Daily Blog, called for the New Zealand Security Intelligence Service to carry out a sweeping investigation of Chinese influence, in inverted commas, in New Zealand. The Greens are completely complicit in this by supporting military spending. They have postured as opponents of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but when it comes to the unprecedented increase in military spending, they support it and claim it will be used for disaster relief and other so-called humanitarian purposes. The Pacific is once again becoming a key geostrategic battleground, as it was in World War II. New Zealand and Australia, both members of the Five Eyes Security Alliance, are seeking to shore up their military and economic dominance in the Southwest Pacific, with American support to counter Beijing's growing influence. Washington demands that all its allies in the region put themselves on a war footing. In an indication of the knife edge on which global geostrategic tensions are now balanced, media reports just this morning have revealed that America's so-called doomsday planes took to the air on Friday. 2 US Navy nuclear war command posts, one on each coast of the US, were initiating the so-called take charge and move out defence protocol, dispersing the command and communications facilities needed to control the US nuclear arsenal. These aircraft are activated by the Pentagon when it is deemed necessary to communicate with the US Navy's secretive nuclear missile submarines, stealth bombers and missile silos. The prospect of a disastrous war between nuclear-armed states is growing ever more present. None of this has received any attention in the current election campaign. In both televised leaders' debates so far, there has not been a single question on foreign policy, even though the second was held just hours after the US debate between Trump and Biden. When asked about Trump, Ardern replied that she would work with whoever occupies the White House after November, while opposition leader Collins praised Trump's Middle East policies, which is leading to war involving Iran. Leon Trotsky, in the Third International After Lenin, written in 1930, explained, quote, "In the period of crisis, the hegemony of the United States will operate more completely, more openly, and more ruthlessly than in the period of boom. The United States will seek to overcome and extricate herself from her difficulties and maladies, primarily at the expense of Europe, regardless of whether this occurs in Asia, Canada, South America, Australia, or Europe itself, or whether this takes place peacefully or through war. The crisis centred in the US, but expanding globally, shows the historic bankruptcy of the capitalist system itself. These developments open up the opportunity for the intervention of the working class as a decisive historical force. This is now beginning to emerge. In a perspective posted on the 3rd January 2020, entitled "The Decade of Socialist Revolution Begins," the World Socialist website declared, quote, "The arrival of the new year marks the beginning of a decade of intensifying world socialist revolution." In the future, when learned historians write about the upheavals of the 21st century, they will enumerate all the obvious signs that existed as the 2020s began of the revolutionary storm that was soon to sweep across the globe. The scholars, with a vast array of facts, documents, charts, website, and social media postings, and other forms of valuable digitized information at their disposal, will describe the 2010s as a period characterized by an intractable economic, social, and political crisis of the world capitalist system. The growth of the working class and the emergence of class struggle on an international scale are the objective basis for the revolution. However, the spontaneous struggles of workers and their instinctive striving for socialism are, by themselves, inadequate. The transformation of the class struggle into a conscious movement for socialism is the basic question of political leadership. The ICFI, the International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Trotskyist Movement, of which the Socialist Equality Group New Zealand is a part, is that leadership. We invite you to consider our program in perspective, and if you agree with it, join and help build this party. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Now I'd like to invite Carolyn Kennett, a member of the Socialist Equality Party Australia, to speak. She's also a member of the Committee for the Public Education and Rights on Education for the World Socialist website.
Thanks, Matthew, and welcome to everybody to the meeting. It's often said that we are living through unprecedented times, but it is actually the case. The world's population face a crisis which has left 1 million dead and over 34 million infected with one of the most infectious viruses seen to date. Many more millions are unemployed, underemployed, face poverty, hunger and homelessness. And we are not speaking only of the underdeveloped countries, but the richest and most powerful countries on earth. Capitalism is turning to dictatorial forms of rule, as evidenced in the US elections. The pandemic was both predictable and predicted, but ignored by every capitalist government. From the outset, the only concern by those same governments is driving workers back to work, lifting lockdowns and restrictions and increasing profits. It is for that reason that the reopening of schools is a focal point of every government. If the schools are closed, then the parents of children can't work. So the demand is that they open, irrespective of how many lives it costs of teachers, students, their families, and in the wider community. This has provoked a new impetus to the resurgence of the class struggle already underway. Over the past several months, workers in major manufacturing facilities throughout America's industrial heartland, as well as educators throughout the United States, have opposed the demand that they stand in front of classes despite the risks. Teachers in the US are preparing not just their class lessons, but their will and testaments in preparation for their possible deaths with COVID-19. There is growing strikes, protests and opposition to the reopening of schools as the new academic year begins in the Northern Hemisphere. High school students in Greece are occupying more than 700 schools to protest the unsafe return to classrooms. The demands of students include limiting classroom groups to at the most 15 students, for immediately hiring more teachers to fill in the gaps, the permanent cleaning staff be hired, and that cameras not be installed in schools for e-learning, as proposed by the government. The response of the Australian ruling elite and the political establishment in Australia to the pandemic, like its counterparts internationally, had been dictated solely by the interests of the corporate and financial elite. As we say in the Australian SEP's resolution from this year, the pandemic has been treated as an economic, not a health crisis, with trillions being poured into the financial markets and corporate coffers to benefit the super wealthy, while health systems have been starved of desperately needed funds. At the same time, the ruling classes are exploiting the opportunity to completely restructure class relations. The precipitous drive to force workers back to work, knowing that it will lead to rising infection rates, was preceded during the lockdown with the axing of penalty rates, a massive destruction of jobs, wholesale changes to working hours and conditions, and wage cuts. This refashioning of class relations is happening in many industries. For example, in the mining industry, construction, manufacturing and retail. But the one I'm most familiar with is what is happening in education, and in particular higher education. So that is the example that I would like to draw on in these remarks. In the face of massive budget cuts by both Labor and Liberal governments alike over decades, universities in Australia and globally have increasingly turned to international student fees to fund teaching and research activities. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought to a head the crisis of underfunding that has been developing for decades. Conservative estimates are predicting that the economic cost of the pandemic to the tertiary sector in Australia will be up to $16 billion by 2023, triggering 21,000 job losses in 2020 alone. The pandemic is being exploited to accelerate the pro-business gutting and restructuring of universities, and the trade unions are playing a central role in this war. In the face of billions of dollars of lost revenue, the National Tertiary Education, which represents university workers, both academic and professional, went into secret negotiations with university managements to offer the so-called National Job Protection Framework. The framework offered university managements up to 15% wage cuts for university workers and the union's willingness to act as industrial police force to oversee thousands of job cuts across the sector. Understandably, university workers responded to these secret negotiations with extreme hostility. Despite the rebellion by workers which led to the collapse of the national framework, the union has pressed ahead using anti-democratic measures to force through agreements that impose pay cuts and intensified workloads at individual universities. As we have warned, the crisis is being used to restructure the tertiary sector, subordinating it even more to the demands of big business. The unions are playing the role of the enforcer for these demands. Many universities have announced major restructures with the destruction of thousands of permanent positions and the slashing of courses. On top of the 11,000 job cuts that have already been announced by universities across Australia, thousands of casual and short-term contract jobs have also been lost. Workers rightly have reacted with hostility to the role that the union is playing, but hostility is not enough. The experience of the past 6 months has proved incontrovertibly that capitalism has failed, and to rely on Labor, the Greens or the unions is futile. Doing everything they can to block the revolt against the NTU, the pseudo-left promote the illusion that the unions can be forced to act to defend workers' rights. They are incorporated in all layers of the NTU, holding leadership positions at a number of universities, as well as in state and national positions. Our analysis has exposed the bankruptcy of their positions. These organisations are closely integrated with the political establishment and speak for layers of the upper middle class for whom identity politics is the ticket to lucrative positions within corporations, universities, the trade unions and the state apparatus. They have played a pernicious role over decades in promoting the poison of identity politics, which is aimed at denying that the fundamental divide in capitalist society, class, thereby undermining the unity of the working class. Their unwavering support for the trade union bureaucracies is a clear warning that in the coming class struggles, these groups will act as the last line of defence for the union apparatuses as workers rebel against their stifling straitjacket. Of course, the situation facing universities here in Australia is not unique. The attacks on tertiary institutions in the UK, the US and many other countries bear a striking resemblance to what is happening here, with the slashing of jobs and conditions triggered by the pandemic, but the result of decades-long assault on public education. 30,000 jobs are threatened in higher education in the United Kingdom, where the pandemic is also being used to restructure higher education. New Zealand is not immune to these processes. As in Australia, almost all universities are addressing the funding crisis by slashing jobs. Casual and short-term contracts are already not being renewed. Victoria University has recently announced cutting up to 300 permanent jobs, and Waikato University and Auckland University have announced job cuts across the board in response to the drop in international student fees, while AUT in Auckland has not ruled out redundancies. The ICFI, through its sections in Europe, North America, Asia and Australia, are calling for the formation of rank and file committees of workers in education and other industries. The ruling class have proved themselves to be entirely incapable of dealing with the pandemic from the standpoint of the needs of society. The working class must take control from the ruling class and fight for a rational and scientific response to the pandemic that puts the needs of society before the needs of profit. This is why we are calling for the formation of rank and file committees. What is required is a correct political program and perspective. Members of the SEP Australia and the CFPE are calling for the formation of rank and file committees independent of the unions to fight for a unified national struggle against the attacks on jobs, pay and conditions, and to ensure the health and safety of workers. Such committees have already formed in cities in the United States, in Germany and the UK, as well as in Australia. Many of these committees have been formed by educators deeply concerned about the reopening of schools, but there are also a number of committees based in factories and other industries, such as the auto industry in the US and bus drivers in London. This struggle can only proceed on an international basis as a conscious political struggle independent from the union bureaucracies and those who would subordinate the working class to the interests of capital. The rapid spread and global nature of the pandemic and its devastating economic and social impacts demonstrate the impossibility of walling off any country or continent, including Australia and New Zealand, from the resulting crisis. National borders cannot protect the world's population because of the vast interconnectedness of contemporary economic and social life. There is no national solution to the pandemic, as there is no national solution to any of the great problems confronting the working class. A global answer is necessary. This is the significance of the relaunch of the World Socialist website. Its role is to arm the working class with the theoretical understanding, historical knowledge and political insight necessary to wage a highly conscious political struggle against capitalism. The threat posed to millions more lives and livelihoods can only be countered through the mobilisation of the international working class, the only force that can overturn the capitalist profit system, which is a barrier to the international coordination of economic, scientific, industrial and information resources needed to combat the virus. You can see the CFPE's contact details on your screen. We urge you to contact us using the links to get involved in the CFPE and for assistance in establishing rank and file committees. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. So now I would like to introduce Tom Peters, who is a leading member of the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand and a regular contributor to the World Socialist website.
Hello, thank you very much, Matty. Thank you also to everyone attending and to both John and Carolyn for speaking. I thought I might just remind people that we would love to answer your questions following my presentation, and so if you have questions, please do write them in the chat box there, or you can think of them and write them in as I am talking, and it would be great to have some discussion. Well, without further ado, I think to begin with, as John explained, New Zealand is not an exception at all, and as Carolyn also said, not an exception to the global breakdown of the whole capitalist system that we are witnessing throughout the world, most graphically in the United States. But no less than Joe Biden and Donald Trump, Jacinda Ardern and her National Party opponent, Judith Collins, are completely incapable of discussing their real agenda with any honesty. They are reduced in these debates to the most banal platitudes about how they're going to create jobs and fix the economy, while absolutely accepting that it's inevitable there will be a vast increase in unemployment and inequality in the very immediate future. The Labour Party has actually completely refused to announce any major policies in the election. And they say that's because things are just too unpredictable with COVID-19. But the real reason that none of them can talk openly about their policies is because they would never be voted for. All the parliamentary parties are engaged in a massive conspiracy against the working class. And whatever government is formed after the election is going to act on behalf of the financial aristocracy to intensify the extraction of tens of billions of dollars from workers' wages, their living conditions, the basic social services that they rely upon, in order to pay for the vast transfers of wealth to corporations and the banks. They will divert billions more to the military, as John has explained, so it can join in the US imperialist preparations for war against China. The Labour Party is contesting the election primarily on the basis of the nationalist propaganda that it has somehow saved the country from the pandemic. And the corporate media throughout the world presents New Zealand as a safe haven or a life raft in dangerous times. Ardern is glorified literally as a saint and as the antithesis to Donald Trump and other right-wing leaders. All of that is a fraud. In New Zealand, as in every other country, the priority of the government has been to protect corporate profits at the expense of people's safety and their lives. The relatively early lockdown here has so far limited the death toll to 25. That was imposed at the end of March, but not because of the benevolence and wisdom of Jacinda Ardern. Her government was forced to act out of fear of a movement of the working class. As New Zealand's outbreak began to emerge early in the year, online petitions started by doctors and healthcare workers quickly gained a combined total of 150,000 signatures demanding a lockdown. As you can see in this slide, this is just one of the petitions that over really a couple of days gained, I think, 70,000 signatures. And as with the walkouts and the strikes by workers that Carolyn referred to that have taken place in Europe, for example, the popular demands in New Zealand emerged completely independently of the pro-government, pro-corporate unions that wanted to keep everything open. And they were quite open about their position. The nurses union, for example, angrily denounced this petition that's on the screen now. The NZNO said it was alarmist and disappointing, and that people should just follow the government's advice. The teachers union, the PPTA in particular, also echoed the government's lie that schools were going to remain open because they were safe. However, they were forced to change their position when the Ardern government, which had already been shaken by 2 years of increasing strikes and working class struggles against austerity, imposed a lockdown. So in 2018, there had been nationwide strikes by nurses, healthcare workers, and by teachers. And that continued into 2019 on a scale that really had not been seen for at least 3 decades. So this is the teachers' strike in Auckland in 2019. And this was part of a global movement, which Carolyn has given some description of, It was described by one capitalist think tank in 2019 as a leaderless revolution, an unprecedented mass eruption of protest against austerity and strikes on every continent, against the growth of social inequality primarily, which had risen to obscene levels since the 2008 financial crash. These strikes in New Zealand, as they were internationally, were suffocated and betrayed by the union bureaucracy, which agreed with the Labour government to effectively freeze staffing and freeze wages, and repeated the government's mantra that there was no money to address the crisis in schools and hospitals. The anger and resentment, however, among teachers and healthcare workers and many others only continued to build up. Also, everybody knew that the health system here would be completely unable to cope with a serious pandemic. One factor behind the petitions and how rapidly they emerged was the fact that there had been an uncontrolled outbreak of measles late last year, which spread from Auckland to Samoa and killed more than 80 people in that country, which was entirely avoidable and the product of gross negligence by the Samoan government, but also the New Zealand government, which had failed to vaccinate enough people here and had failed to implement proper border controls to stop it spreading. So, to preempt an eruption of popular opposition outside the control of the pro-Labour Party unions, Ardern announced a very strict lockdown, or a relatively strict lockdown, in late March. But then those restrictions were lifted much too early, against the advice of some of the government's own experts. And Ardern, like her global counterparts, made it very clear to big business that their demands would come first before public health care, and the government was not going to return to another nationwide lockdown. Moreover, as the World Health Organization and others have consistently said, a lockdown is only effective if it is used to massively strengthen the healthcare system in preparation for any future outbreaks. But instead, testing in New Zealand plummeted to dangerously low levels, which meant that a second outbreak in Auckland was able to spread undetected well into August, leading to more avoidable deaths. So the working class still faces very great dangers as long as the coronavirus continues to spread rapidly across the globe. The only solution, as we've argued on the World Socialist website, is through the international coordination of resources on the basis of human need and scientific planning. But that is totally incompatible with capitalism, with the division of the world into rival nation states and the dominance of private corporations, particularly over healthcare. Jacinda Ardern's nationalist slogan in this election and throughout the pandemic has been that New Zealand is a, quote, team of 5 million working together. That is another lie. Her most important policy response to the pandemic has been the same as it was in the United States, Europe, Australia, and everywhere else in the world: an unprecedented bailout of the super rich and the prioritization of profit over lives. In America, you have the multi-trillion-dollar CARES Act, backed by the Republicans and Democrats unanimously, the biggest bailout of the rich ever in history. Now the American ruling class is slashing jobs and benefits and inflicting mass suffering on an unprecedented scale. Here, the process is essentially the same. A total of $100 billion is being printed by the Reserve Bank to prop up the private bank's profits. Another $50 billion is being distributed to businesses in the form of tax concessions and handouts that are falsely described as wage subsidies. The fact is that major corporations have received millions in this way while sacking thousands of people. The trade union bureaucracy, like its counterparts around the world, is collaborating in this historic assault on the working class. The unions have behaved exactly like those that Carolyn described in Australia and other countries. Firstly, they opposed lockdowns then when they organised redundancies and endorsed the bailouts of the rich. As Carolyn explained, the actions of the working class that have resisted these policies have been, almost entirely independent of the trade union framework. The unions are not workers' organisations. They operate, as we've seen, as agents of the corporate elite and the government. Here you can see a petition that was circulated and signed by thousands of meat workers in New Zealand, demanding the closure of the meat processing industry in April, because it was well known by that point that this was a significant source of infections in the United States and other countries. But the Meat Workers Union completely opposed this and worked closely with the companies to keep the factories up and running. So when Labour and the unions talk about Team New Zealand, or the team of 5 million, what they mean is essentially the same as Donald Trump and his slogan of America First. It means the total subordination of workers' interests, their health and their lives to the national interest of corporations and the rich. The Labour Party here is a party of big business and the rich. In the 1980s, well, before the 1980s really, it had already abandoned any pretense of a reformist program. And the Labour government that was elected in 1984 quickly became the poster child for right-wing restructuring all throughout the world. David Lange and his finance minister, Roger Douglas, led the way for social democratic parties internationally to be transformed into the direct instruments of the financial elite. They responded to the globalization of production by dismantling local industries in New Zealand, dismantling the social welfare state, and deregulating the labour market in favour of giant corporations. It's an agenda that completely mirrored that of Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in Britain. Whole industries such as the railways, telecommunications, and forestry were prepared for privatisation with mass redundancies. Private companies were allowed to enter into aged care and into healthcare to undermine those public services. Public hospitals were shut down all across the country, particularly during the 90s, but that was prepared by the Labour government in the 80s. And it paved the way for what we are seeing now, a real crisis in the health system, which already before the pandemic, as we've documented on the World Socialist website, was killing many patients, basically, by endlessly delaying their treatment for things like cancer. So once again, in the response to the pandemic, there is no real difference between New Zealand's Labour government and the overtly right-wing governments internationally. And that's the real reason that Jacinda Ardern is being glorified incessantly by the world's newspapers. All of the claims that Ardern and the Labour Party are now making in interviews and on debates on TV, that they are somehow different from National because they're not going to implement austerity measures, all of that is a transparent lie. They are already implementing austerity measures. Again, look at the health system. In the middle of the biggest public health crisis in a century, you have general practice nurses, thousands of nurses who have gone on strike recently over their low wages, and hospital workers in Christchurch who have been protesting because the facilities there are sitting empty and the whole hospital is in hundreds of millions of dollars of debt, and they can't properly staff their buildings. In Wellington, there are reports of the mental health unit completely overflowing with patients because of the lack of space and the lack of staffing. People are forced to sleep in the corridors and similar situations. That's repeated all throughout the country. There's one estimate that the system as a whole requires an extra 25% increase in the number of medical specialists just to keep up with demand. So when he was asked about that in a recent interview, the health minister, Chris Hipkins' response was, quote, "You can't just magic up the workforce out of nowhere." And he's now ordering the district health boards to repay approximately, I think, $800 million in deficits. So during the nurses' struggle in 2018, which I referred to earlier, the Labour government cynically declared at the time that even though it had billions of dollars in its coffers, there was no way that it could spend that to address the staffing shortage and low wages in hospitals. The health minister claimed that money had to be set aside in case there was an emergency. But what are we living through now in this pandemic if it's not an emergency? The fact is that workers all over the world are told that there is no money for the healthcare services that they rely on. And now everyone can see that this is a total lie, because there's virtually unlimited money for the banks, for big business, and for the top 5% or so of society that lives off its investment in the stock market and the property boom. In fact, there are now numerous worried media commentators who are pointing out that the government has, quote, failed to reduce inequality, which it was the center of its election campaign in 2017. But failure is really the wrong word. All of the pseudo-populist rhetoric that Ardern and the Labour Party have been engaged in since 2017 was always a fraud. Ardern is a certain type of leader. She's comparable to those that have been put forward in other countries by the capitalist class in recent years, such as Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, Podemos in Spain, Syriza in Greece, or Bernie Sanders in America, basically to try and channel the rising opposition to capitalism that has been building up in response to decades of austerity. Ardern even invented a new role for herself. She called herself the Minister for Child Poverty Reduction, and following the election, she said that was the reason she had entered politics. But like all of the global parties and individuals that I mentioned, the Ardern government is a thoroughly right-wing government. It was brought to power, as John went through, thanks to the intervention of the US ambassador, and thanks to the extreme right-wing New Zealand First Party. They were joined in a coalition by the Green Party, and this was then fraudulently promoted as a left-wing government throughout the world, but also by significant forces in New Zealand, all of the trade unions, the International Socialist Organization and other pseudo-left organizations, the Daily Blog, which is funded by several unions, and basically every other liberal and pseudo-left commentator. The Socialist Equality Group, our organization, was the only tendency that opposed the Ardern government clearly and consistently from the standpoint of socialism. We explained to workers that it would attack living conditions, it would stoke nationalism, it would attack immigrants, and it would build up the military. And we have been proven entirely correct. All of the claims made by Ardern in her recent debates that her government has somehow alleviated child poverty are barefaced lies. Even before the pandemic, 1 in 4 children lived in poverty, basically unchanged for the past 3 years. Youth suicide is basically unchanged. It's nearly the worst in the developed world. Working people now face the most devastating crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The median income has plummeted just in the past year by 7.6%, with 1/3 of households reporting a loss of income. The number of people on welfare has soared by 53%, or 77,000 people, between March and August. The number of food banks has exploded in every city, sometimes by 200 or 400%. So the median the median house price has increased by 27% in 3 years. Homelessness has become deeply entrenched. The number of families on the public housing waiting list has exploded from about 6,000 to nearly 20,000. Remember, the Labour Party promised to address this crisis. They promised that they would build affordable housing. They've done absolutely nothing. The Ardern government has responded to inequality by scapegoating immigrants and by attempting to whip up racism and xenophobia. If you read The Guardian or the New York Times, they would have you believe that New Zealand is somehow immune to the sort of politics that's associated with the Brexit referendum in Britain or the mass deportations in the United States, or the promotion of fascist parties throughout Europe and Latin America. But the reality is that the Labour New Zealand First Green Party coalition embodies this international tendency, this lurch to the right in official politics. It is not accidental that Jacinda Ardern has repeatedly refused to condemn Donald Trump's racism. She's been asked about it more than once, not to mention his recent threats to carry out a fascist coup d'etat in the election. That is not an oversight. It goes hand in hand with the government strengthening New Zealand's alliance with Washington as it threatens war against China. As John explained, the leading role in all of this is played by New Zealand First, which really sets the tone in the government and the policy agenda. It has consistently demonized Muslims and immigrants, especially those from China, and the Labour Party and the Greens have embraced it and elevated this party. If New Zealand is some sort of unspoiled garden in the midst of death and destruction, how does one explain the Christchurch massacre? Only the willfully deceptive or naive believe that this was just the product of an Australian interloper. Nothing is being discussed in this election about what was one of the world's most deadly right-wing attacks by the fascist gunman Brenton Tarrant. After he was sentenced in August, Jacinda Ardern declared she did not want to speak about him ever again. That is because Tarrant is the product of policies promoted for decades, including by the Labour Party, to divide the working class and to justify Australian and New Zealand participation in the criminal wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There are still many unanswered questions about the attack. Tarrant's manifesto has been banned in order to hide the fact that it mirrors all of the political filth of New Zealand First in particular, but also the Labour Party's anti-immigrant policies. The Royal Commission of Inquiry that is supposedly investigating this attack is being held entirely in secret. No explanation has been provided as to why the police and intelligence agencies did not prevent Tarrant from carrying out his deadly rampage. Now this tragedy is being exploited, both in New Zealand and internationally, to justify internet censorship and to boost the police and intelligence agencies. The new powers and resources will not be used against the far right. They are a preparation to suppress movements against capitalism and against war. And that is the record of such policies all throughout New Zealand's history and the history of every other country. In response to the pandemic, this government has treated immigrants with extreme cruelty. Migrant workers who lose their jobs are barred from accessing welfare benefits. The Deputy Prime Minister and New Zealand First Leader, Winston Peters, has told them they have to leave the country, which in many cases would mean return to countries where COVID-19 is out of control, effectively a death sentence, as one immigrant told us. The Socialist Equality Group calls on the working class to come to the defense of immigrants. Our movement insists that workers must have the same rights regardless of their nationality or where they were born. The system of borders that's used to divide the working class is reactionary, and it's antithetical to human progress. We stand opposed to every tendency that whips up nationalism, including the trade unions and the union-backed daily blog and the Green Party, which falsely claims to represent some sort of kinder alternative, but has actually, as I said, played a crucial role in propping up this government and enabling all of its reactionary policies. Speaking about the Green Party, the government has done absolutely nothing to stop the degradation of the environment and climate emissions, despite the mass protests led by school students that were particularly large in New Zealand. The Green Party, just like its cousins in Europe and Australia, vehemently opposes the only real solution to climate change, which is a revolutionary transformation of society on a global scale that abolishes the profit system and all its incentives to pollute. The party represents well-off layers of the middle class who seek to profit from so-called environmental businesses. In this election, a major initiative by the Greens, among others, is the two referenda to legalize cannabis and to legalize euthanasia. We oppose both of these proposed law changes, which represent a major diversion from the life and death questions facing the working class. Basically, as workers are being plunged into poverty, significant sections of the ruling elite want to encourage them to use drugs, and their aim is twofold: to deaden the consciousness of the young people, prevent them from organizing against capitalism, and to profit from what is an expanding public health crisis. Likewise, euthanasia, if it is legalized, will be used to justify more healthcare spending cuts. This is being put forward at a time when politicians throughout the world are demanding openly that elderly people should just be allowed to die from the coronavirus so that the economy can open up and they can stop being a drain on the profits of big business. This election is not going to resolve any of the pressing issues that working people face. We are living in a revolutionary period of history where the alternatives are either the intensification of the present crisis, leading to world war, dictatorship, more uncontrolled pandemics, and catastrophic climate change, or the revolutionary fight to abolish capitalism and to build a planned international socialist economy. There's no third reformist alternative. Workers will engage in major struggles. They already have, as I mentioned, over the past 2 years on an unprecedented global scale. That is going to re-emerge with a real force. But as Trotsky explained, history is not an automatic process, and the fight to end capitalism is not going to succeed as some sort of spontaneous movement. It needs more than just the anger of masses of people. It requires new organizations and a new political leadership. And that's what we are fighting for. That includes what Carolyn mentioned in the schools, in the hospitals and factories and other workplaces. Workers need their own organizations. They need rank and file committees controlled by the workers themselves to unite both within New Zealand and also internationally. As long as workers remain trapped within the trade unions, they will be subordinated to their pro-capitalist politics, subordinated to the Labour Party, and they will remain vulnerable to the pandemic because, as the unions have shown again and again, they will send workers to work in unsafe conditions. But above all, a new political party must be built. Historical development has reached an impasse. Masses of people can see that the level of social polarization is obscene and irrational. All of the technical means exist to eliminate poverty, to address climate change and the healthcare crisis. But these are all subordinated to the control of a tiny fraction of the world's population. So I would urge you, the political decisions of those of you listening today are critical. We encourage you to read the World Socialist website, explore its brilliant new design if you're already a reader, study the analysis and the political program of the International Committee of the Fourth International, and join us in the fight to build a party here in New Zealand as a section of this World Party of Socialist Revolution. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering some of your questions.
Thank you, Tom. So before we take questions, I'll just read a comment that was left thanking Tom for his speaking. So a panelist said, "No questions, just want to commend Tom Peters in his delivery of the truth. Thanks, Tom." So if our panelists can come back, we have a number of questions. So the first one comes from Hassan, who says, "How could we force the government not to make the COVID-19 vaccine mandatory?" Would anyone like to respond to this?
Okay, I think the real problem is, how do we force the government to make sure the vaccine is made available to everybody? I mean, you know, the issue is not that governments are going to make the vaccine mandatory. The real problem facing the entire population of the world is, are they going to be able to get it at all? That is, I mean, well, firstly, we don't know if a vaccine is actually going to be produced. That's not a given. You know, there are plenty of viruses that can't be vaccinated against. So, you know, even assuming that it is produced, it will still take another year, maybe 2 years, before it can reach the stage that it's distributed among the population. And then all of this is totally subordinated to the interests of big business, to the profit system. And it will not be distributed unless someone is going to make money out of it. That's the real danger facing the poor, facing the working class. And it's a danger, really, that can only be resolved through struggle, through revolutionary struggle against the profit system. I mean, that's how I would answer that question.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I will read 2 more questions that have come in, and panelists can decide which ones they'd like to respond to. And while I read them, they can prepare. So another question also from Hassan. How could we force the government not to engage in a war against China? And a third question, postal workers in Australia are going through restructuring to prepare for what will no doubt be future job cuts and privatisation. It has caused major opposition amongst postal workers, and the unions are doing everything they can to make sure this restructuring goes through. They've used the excuse of COVID-19 to carry out long-held plans. What is the situation taking place with workers in New Zealand? Are workers there confronting a similar situation? Before anyone responds, I'll just make a call for any additional questions that people have. Would anyone like to respond to those 2 questions?
Well, perhaps if I can pick up on the question about the war against China. Well, firstly, the only solution to the fight against war is the mobilisation of the working class internationally. The governments are not subject to pressure by this sort of, by peace groups, by various sort of organisations that think that there is some sort of road to peacefully establish an accord between imperialist nations. The drive towards war is absolutely bound up with the collapse of capitalism itself. War is a product of the internal contradictions of the capitalist system. the division of the world into nation states, the drive for profits, the need of massive corporations to compete using their sort of national state as a basis for competing against others, and for really the intensification of the struggle of one against all. None of this can be opposed by trying to pressure governments to change course. What is required is the mobilisation of the working class across national borders against war. And that's a very urgent task. One of the issues that we deal with is that many years ago during the Iraq War, there were massive protests by millions of young people and workers internationally to oppose that war. But they came to nothing. And one of the reasons, or the critical reason for that, is because they were not based on a revolutionary strategy that required the mobilisation of working people, but by appeals to various governments. And we oppose entirely that, that prescription. The working class needs to be mobilised on an anti-war platform, and it needs to be done very urgently. As I pointed out, there are now real preparations being made for inter-imperialist conflicts that could well involve nuclear weapons, and this can only be taken forward on a fight against capitalism and imperialism.
We have another question from Derek. Could you speak more on the expansion of the police in New Zealand? We also have the question about if any workers in New Zealand face similar situations to postal workers in Australia, where the unions and employers are trying to ram through restructuring. So would anyone like to respond to either of those?
Well, in answer to the question of what the working class is facing, which is a very good question, and one could talk about it at some length, and I don't have all of the facts at my fingertips, but every section of the working class here, as in Australia, is under attack, and this has unfolded, extremely rapidly, and I think in a way that has shocked a lot of people. And that has taken, I guess, many forms, but the main form is just mass redundancies from, as I mentioned, major corporations. Fletcher Building, I think, made at least 1,000 people redundant. One of the largest the largest construction company in New Zealand. Sky City Casino made a similar number of people redundant in Auckland. They were assisted by the Unite Union, which is sometimes portrayed as a radical union by the pseudo-left groups. They just, rammed through those redundancies. There has been you might call it a blitzkrieg of these job cuts throughout the country. There was the announcement by The Warehouse, which is a major cheap department store chain, that they have sacked thousands of people and closed a number of stores throughout the country. And they had received, millions of dollars from the government. In fact, all of those companies that I mentioned and many others that have made these job cuts have profited from the government's, so-called wage subsidy scheme, which they claim is all about keeping people employed. And that's just, as we can see, a complete and utter lie. So that's the situation. I mean, there will be, I'm certain, more I guess, the intensification of exploitation of workers within the postal system here and within, public transport. I think, every section of society, workers are being told, basically, your wages are going to be frozen, if not cut back. Your hours may be cut back. There's a massive pool of unemployed out there, which is going to be used to drive down conditions and wages. And so a real crisis is developing, and I think the most important thing, as with the postal workers in Australia, in fact, is that workers are not going to remain passive in the face of this onslaught. They will, as they have in the past 2 years, we're going to see the re-emergence of working class struggles on a mass scale. But that is going to have to happen in opposition to the unions, which are imposing all of this. I would urge anyone listening who is facing these sorts of attacks to get in touch with us, and really, and we can begin a discussion about some of the proposals that we've outlined today for new. What is the way forward, really, for workers who are facing these attacks? So just make those points.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, so we've got another couple of questions coming in. The standing question is from Derek, and it's, could you speak more about the expansion of police? We have a question from Vasu Haika. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. Just a quick question. I agree we need to mobilize the working class to participate and protest, but they need some sort of guaranteed income for the loss of their jobs or income. How can we deal with this? And question 6 from Sam. Do any of the current New Zealand political parties, if any, hold any promise as vehicles or allies in the revolutionary struggle?
Well, perhaps I can go through some of these. I mean, feel free to jump in, John, as well. But I guess in relation to the police, firstly, there has been a very significant expansion just of police numbers under the Labour government, and that was part of their coalition agreement with New Zealand First, which was hailed as everyone as some sort of major progressive deal in 2017. As a matter of fact, they have, they promised to increase the police by an extra 1,800 officers, which would have been, I think, about a 20% increase from the figures in 2016. So I don't know if they've reached that target, but they have certainly expanded the number of police very significantly. They've also rolled out a number of police training programs targeting working class schools. So you now have high school students being offered, I forget what it's called, but there's a specific program that they can basically train to then go into the police academy once they graduate high school. And of course, it means you have police basically present in these schools in working class neighborhoods. The Christchurch massacre in 2019, which could only take place because the police in Australia and New Zealand had ignored warnings about neo-Nazi threats, that was then used to justify a 6-month trial in which police in parts of Auckland, Christchurch and Waikato were given firearms on a routine basis, which police have access to firearms normally just in their car, but in this case you had armed patrols with wandering around in those working class areas. That triggered a massive wave of opposition, and I think it contributed to some of the protests that we've seen here this year in June, following the killing of George Floyd in the United States, thousands of young people in particular held massive protests against that, and in solidarity with the victims of police killings in the United States, but also against the pervasive brutality of the police and the arming of the police in New Zealand, as well as racism as well. So once again, the general international tendency of militarizing the police force is very much present in New Zealand.
I think as well, it's worth mentioning some of the other measures that were implemented following the Christchurch massacre, in particular the moves that Ardern has led internationally for censorship of the internet. If you remember, she went to Paris and with the assistance of leaders from other major countries, issued what was called the Christchurch Call, which prompted a host of measures now to censor the internet in all sorts of ways, and I imagine you're familiar with that. But the censorship of the internet and it goes hand in hand with the measures that Tom has just outlined, and Ardern and the Labor government have played a leading role in that. Interestingly, as well, and significantly in New Zealand, nobody has raised, apart from the Socialist Equality Group New Zealand and a group around the Assange campaign, nobody from the bourgeois press, from the established parties, has raised the question of Assange and his incarceration in Belmarsh. Assange, of course, is an Australian citizen who has suffered enormously under the attempts by the US to drag him back and throw him into prison. There was a forum at Parliament last year involving some of New Zealand's media people, politicians, and all of them basically took the view that Assange should be thrown under a bus, and that's a very significant indication of preparations against the working class as a whole. Perhaps to pick up on one of the other questions, in fact, the last question about whether there's any current political parties that could be considered an ally in the struggle for socialism. Well, the answer is flatly no, and my reference to the situation with Assange just now underlines that. Every party that's standing in the current election accepts the entire framework, really, of the fact that the working class are going to have to pay for the austerity measures. They accept the profit system and everything that it stands for, and they will join with Labor and any other parties in pursuing that. This includes as well the parties that we characterise as pseudo-lefts. Tom mentioned the International Socialist Organisation. There's also Socialist Aotearoa, who are all defending the Ardern government. They, from one perspective or another. In fact, they don't any longer say that Ardern is the lesser evil. What they say is that, in fact, that this is every prospect of being a progressive government, that if Labor is returned with a large majority, they will be subject to pressure from below, and it's a complete fraud. These organisations that have spent years circling the Labor government and trying to prop it up are completely bankrupt. And in order to recognise that, you only have to look at the experience of the alliance that went into government with the Clark government and voted in favour of sending the SAS to Afghanistan. And they played essentially the same role or prefigured the role that Syriza has played in Greece. So the answer to your question is no, there are no established parties. And that's why we're calling on workers and youth to build the Socialist Equality Group into a party which is the New Zealand section of the International Committee of the Fourth International, the World Trotskyist Movement.
Thanks, John. So I've had an indication for another speaker to address some of the questions. So I'd like to introduce Cheryl Crisp, the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party in Australia, who's going to join us responding to some of these questions.
Welcome to all participants in this meeting. I mean, I think the points which all the speakers have raised, I think are really very important. And for an audience in New Zealand, it would be understandable if you were to think that nothing else happens outside the world other than the land of the long white cloud. And I think the importance of holding our meeting, in which there are participants from certainly Australia, but also other countries, it's because we are an international organisation. The International Committee of the Fourth International is the Trotskyist movement. It is the socialist international movement throughout the world. And we, quite frankly, are the only ones who raise that, who stand for such a political position. And the reason that we do is because capitalism is a world system, the working class is a world class. And the New Zealand working class has to look towards its class brothers and sisters, just as the Australian workers have to, and every country's working class needs to. You have far more in common with your international comrades internationally than you do with any political organisation or party in New Zealand. And to try and emphasise this point, I think if one looks at what is taking place in the United States, you have a president who has made absolutely clear that his program is one of overturning the Constitution, of establishing a dictatorial form of rule, and of basing that rule on the military, on the police, and on fascist right-wing backward layers of the American population and sections of the disenfranchised, in that sense, sections of the working class and middle class. They are not a mass movement, but of course the danger is that without a response, an independent response by the working class, a revolutionary response by the working class in the United States, they could very well become a mass movement. The reason that Trump is able to carry through these, what is an extraordinary threat, is because of the utter fecklessness and perfidy of Biden, of the Democratic Party, who stand by and will allow such an event to take place because they fear far more a movement of the working class in the United States and internationally than they do of of a dictatorial coup, a coup d'etat, which Trump is threatening to carry out. Now, of course, and one of the points that Carolyn made is that, you know, we live in unprecedented times, and we do. And so the fact that the US president and his wife has now tested positive for COVID-19 is part of that. I know in another meeting it was raised that Trump, in that sense, is like the arsonist who sets fire to the building and is struck down by the forces which they themselves unleash by the fire. You know, that the fact that he has tested positive to COVID-19 is the outcome of the very policies that he and his administration have imposed on the American working class, that has resulted in 7 million infected and more than 210,000 dead. I mean, his policies have resulted in more dead than the Vietnam War, the Afghan War, than the Iraq War, and the Korean War together. Now, if there is a conception that New Zealand is this haven, this Garden of Eden in a land or a world of disease and destruction, that would be a very mistaken conception. In that sense, Ardern is promoted in many ways as no other political leader has been for a great length of time. She's promoted because she's young. She's promoted because she's had a baby. Hardly a unique achievement by a young woman. She's promoted because she can hug people. I mean, all this is a fantasy. All this is the promotion of an individual whose politics are entirely opposed to this fiction which is being put forward about her. I mean, as a Labor leader, she has undertaken a coalition government with one of the most right-wing, racist, anti-working class organisations in the form of New Zealand First, who themselves have put forward something, as Tom has raised, not fundamentally different to Brenton Tarrant. I mean, the issue of anti-Muslim, anti-working class, anti-immigrant attacks, which this organisation has been in the forefront of, how does it differ to what the manifesto that Tarrant put forward? That's why it's banned, not because she wants to ensure that New Zealanders aren't subject to such really fascistic filth, but because it so much coexists and mirrors with what the Labor Party puts forward, as it does here, what the unions put forward, as it does here, the nationalism, as I said, the anti-immigrant policies of the political establishment which exists in New Zealand. And I think, as John said, is there any representatives of the political elite in establishment in New Zealand that would assist in the revolutionary struggles of the working class? No. No, there's not. Just as there's not here, just as there's not in the United States. That's why the working class has to build an alternative, independent, revolutionary party. Because if anything has been revealed by the pandemic, is that capitalism will not and cannot carry through any political or health measures in the interests of society as a whole. They know perfectly well opening up the economy is going to result in increased infections. They know it will result in increased deaths. And they do it because the interests of these organisations is in profit. It is in the wealth and the accumulation of wealth by the capitalist class. In order for workers themselves to fight for their very existence, and that's what we're talking about here, whether it's in the form of climate change, whether it's in the form of defending the lives of ordinary people against the pandemic, it cannot be done through the organisations which exist as the representatives of capitalism. And that is Labour. It is Labour here. It is Labour in the United Kingdom. The struggles which workers are undertaking, whether it's teachers, academics, construction workers, meat workers, they have to turn towards another political perspective. The unions have proven themselves completely at the behest and as the policemen of the struggles of the working class. It is the unions, and here, I mean, you know, the leader of the ACTU, Sally McManus, is actually referred to by the Attorney General, by the Minister for Industrial Relations, Christian Porter, as his best friend forever. Because McManus, this supposed firebrand, you know, this militant firebrand, has actually on a daily basis consulted with the government, advised the government on how to cut penalty rates, how to, increase hours, how to destroy the conditions which still exist amongst the Australian working class. They are no different in New Zealand. And so I think that the issues that arise in the election, which the speakers here have addressed, are ones that are international in character. And so, you know, what we encourage New Zealand workers to do is to turn towards an international party, which is the Socialist Equality Group in New Zealand, the International Committee of the Fourth International internationally, and to read the World Socialist website. It is the only website that speaks in the interests of the working class on an international scale. Nationalism has to be rejected. The conception that New Zealand or Australia is any exception to the processes, to the contradictions which exist on an international scale has to be rejected. You have to turn towards your class brothers and sisters on a revolutionary internationalist standpoint. And on that basis, you know, join the Socialist Equality Group. Just in finally summing up or bringing my remarks to a conclusion, just on the question of vaccinations, I think, as Tom said, the issue is not in that sense whether they're mandatory, but whether they're available at all. But just in regards to vaccinations, and there has been an enormous campaign that has been waged against them on a non-science basis. Vaccinations have been the basis on which the eradication of diseases which caused, you know, death and destruction. It maimed millions of people, whether we're talking about polio, typhoid, whooping cough, measles. I mean, it has been on the basis of vaccinations that millions of workers and poor have been able to survive what have been death sentences in the past. And the fact that there not only has there been a campaign against them, on the basis that, you know, they cause autism or they cause brain, all of which have not been proven, and in fact have been proven to be false. But this is also used as the means of actually cutting back on what are life-saving measures, not just with vaccinations, but with healthcare as a whole. And so, to be frank, if there was a vaccination that was developed that was proven to be, you know, viable and safe, not only would we demand that all people are able to get it, but we would, yes, say that it's mandatory, because it's only on the basis that everyone, as we have seen with the lockdowns, that it's only when everybody is able to carry through these measures that in fact these diseases such as COVID-19 can be defeated. So I think we have to be very mindful. This is not, you know, an attack on individual rights. This in fact enhances the rights of the working class to survive, to live, to be free of diseases which if we go to graveyards and see, you know, the graves of people of 100 and 150 years ago, and see young, you know, babies, youth, people in their 20s and 30s, most of whom, if they weren't killed by war, were killed by diseases which were able to be eradicated. And that is a gain of the working class on an international scale. And that's, I think, how we have to deal with these issues.
Thanks, Cheryl. So the first thing to say is that people who agree with our analysis should contact the Socialist Party Quality Group in New Zealand and join our movement. So if you're in New Zealand and you're listening, we'd encourage you to email us at socialistequalitynz@gmail.com. You can also see our Facebook and Twitter on screen. Now, we're also making an appeal for funds so that we can transform the Socialist Equality Group into the Socialist Equality Party in New Zealand. Our funds for organising and advertising events like this, printing and distributing articles, and party building, they come from your donations. We don't receive any corporate sponsorship or support. So you can see our bank account details on the screen right now, and international listeners, you can donate to our movement through the World Socialist website. You also may be able to find a local chapter of the Socialist Equality Party where you are. So do any of the panelists want to make any more points briefly?
I'd just like to thank everyone for attending. I just wonder if we had missed any questions that should be answered.
Well, we haven't addressed the question from Vasu Haika, who asks about the need to guarantee income for workers as they mobilize to protest, and how they'll deal with the loss of jobs and income.
Well, that's precisely what's driving people into you know, protests and industrial action, is these attacks on their income. I guess perhaps he is, or she, the listener is referring to you know, the fact that there are parties, in particular the Greens, who have advocated a minimum income for every New Zealander. And I think what we would say to that, we would warn actually that this is firstly not going to be implemented. I mean, the Greens can say, you know, they are very much doing what Ardern did 3 years ago in that sense, where she promised all sorts of things to get rid of social inequality, to you know, build 100,000 affordable houses, which was all you know, a total fraud. And this is no different. That's how workers should react when they hear these sorts of policies. So I think I'll just, warn people about that, not to mention the fact that what they propose is totally inadequate for anyone to survive on. But I mean, one could certainly say more, but I wonder if we should begin to wrap up.
Could I add a question just for Carolyn? So you spoke about the need to establish rank and file committees, and you also spoke, and we've spoken quite a bit about unions, but could you just reiterate the difference between a rank and file committee organized by workers and a union?
Well, completely independent of the unions. The unions have proved themselves over decades to be enforcers of the appalling attacks on job conditions and on wages and on. So with the record, if you look at the record of how the unions behave across the world over the last number of decades, what they've done is actually worked with the capitalist class, worked with the employers in order to drive down wages and drive down conditions. And when workers do go on strike and have gone on strike, it's been the unions that have betrayed those strikes. So, and there are plenty of examples of that. The teachers' strikes in the United States in 2019, they were betrayed by the unions. And the example that I raised of what's happening here in Australia, betrayed in universities. The union is working with the employers to drive down wages and conditions and to fragment the working class. So we talk a lot about the fact that the working class is an international class. What unions aim to do is to promote nationalism, so to divide workers in countries one from another, and also to divide workplaces as well. So the meat workers in New Zealand, if they are fighting jobs and conditions and attacks, then what happens to them is of importance to the rest of the workers in New Zealand. If one industry gets attacked, other industries get attacked. But the unions try and contain it within national borders, but also within individual workplaces. I mean, that's the whole point of enterprise agreements that are based on single enterprises. It's to atomize the working class. And so we're fighting for the international unity of the working class. And we say that can't take place inside the unions. What has to happen is that workers have to develop their own organizations that are based on the interests of the working class and fight for their own jobs, and in the instance of COVID and the pandemic, to fight for the right to a healthy and safe workplace. I mean, what we're seeing in the United States and in Europe is that the unions are working hand in glove with governments to get teachers back inside schools, and that's happening in New Zealand as well. Because, and as I said in my remarks, why do the governments want schools open? They want schools open so parents can go back to work. Why do they want parents back at work? Because profit is being impacted, and that's being placed above the lives and health and safety of teachers, students, parents, communities. And so we argue that we have to have rank and file committees take those decisions out of the hands of the unions, who are working for the employers and ultimately for the ruling elite to suppress the working class struggle. I don't know whether that answers your question, but this is why we're fighting for rank and file committees, because we say that workers need to take these matters into their own hands, that unless there is a developing and growing movement of the working class that has the correct political perspective, that has leadership, the leadership provided by the Trotskyist movement, then the demands of workers will be subordinated again and again and again to the demands of profit. So we need to fight to overturn what is actually the problem, which is the capitalist system, and that can't be done inside the unions. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that does answer my question. And the importance of workers being independent and able to, for example, organize. I mean, in the case of COVID-19, there's no reason why nurses, doctors and meat workers couldn't work together to fight for the same fundamental sort of workplace safety concerns that they all share, you know?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And mount a joint campaign. Sorry.
Yeah. No, and that's what's happening. So, for instance, in the United Kingdom, there is an educators rank and file committee who is working with the bus drivers, because after all, if kids go back to school, they have to get on buses to go back to school. Workers have to get onto buses. It's in the interest of everybody that people are protected, communities are protected from the pandemic. But you know, it seems that teachers are at the forefront of this because they are being the ones. Well, I mean, obviously this is happening in other industries, but teachers are being forced back into classrooms, including teachers with underlying health issues. You know, and so we all know social distancing is impossible inside classrooms. And at universities as well. I read an article on the World Socialist website by, I think, John, just the other day, about the fact that Auckland University students refused to go back to, they made the right decision. They refused to go back to university in a situation where it was unknown whether the pandemic was under control in Auckland or not. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I'll just make one final call for questions. If anyone has any, we can quickly see them in chat. In the meantime, through Marion Books, we publish a range of literature. Some recent ones are Why Are They Back? Historical Falsification, Political Conspiracy and the Return of Fascism in Germany, which looks at the rise of fascism in Germany. The appointment of Adolf Hitler in January 1933 as Chancellor of Germany was the outcome not of an election, but of a political conspiracy involving a small number of senior military and government officials headed by General Paul von Hindenburg. Its horrific consequences were World War II, the Holocaust, and the destruction of tens of millions of lives. And the youth section of our movement, the IYSSE, the International Youth and Students for Social Equality in Germany, has done some excellent work fighting the rehabilitation of the Nazis that has been happening as sections of the ruling class cultivate neo-fascists. Another of our books is The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century by David North. 100 years after the outbreak of World War I and the Russian Revolution, none of the problems of the 20th century, devastating wars, economic crises, social inequality, and the threat of dictatorship have been solved. In fact, they are posed even more sharply today. This book looks at and responds to some of the arguments that came at the turn of the century about the end of history and responding to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The argument that this was sort of going to be open up a glorious growth of capitalism, untroubled by the struggles of workers that had plagued it in the past. The statement of principles here outlines the basic conceptions of the Socialist Equality Party, and it's the foundation for membership in the party. If you're interested in joining the party, we strongly recommend that you buy this pamphlet, read it, and if you agree with it, apply for membership. Socialism in the Fight Against War looks at the growth of an international movement of the working class and youth against imperialism, and the World Socialist website in the defense of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks chronicles our campaign and defense of Julian Assange against the campaign to slander and attack him and ultimately see him imprisoned in the United States. So if you'd like to order any of these books, if you're in New Zealand, you can email socialistequalitynz@gmail.com and make a request. If you are overseas, you can type in marion.com in a web browser and order from there. At this point, we should wrap up. Final thing to remind everyone is that we've just relaunched the World Socialist website in a new and improved form. It's going to only develop further from here as we start building sections dedicated to particular subjects, and as we extend our reporting. So with those messages, I'd like to conclude our meeting and urge you to join the fight for a genuine socialist alternative. Good night and take care.